Everyone in Britain has spent the last few days breathing a sigh of relief. The heat finally broke. The sky clouded over. Somewhere, a garden hose came out of storage for the first time in weeks. But look past the temperature graph, at the maps underneath it, and that relief starts to look premature. Because while the thermometer has been falling, a different set of maps across the country has been quietly filling in with color. Drought maps, fire severity maps, river flow maps. And every single one of them is telling the same story. The heat didn't just pass through and leave, it rewired the ground itself, and what it left behind is arguably more dangerous than the heat was in the first place. So what actually happened during these 3 weeks? Why does the end of a heat wave sometimes matter less than what it leaves in the soil? And why are meteorologists more worried now with the heat gone than they were 2 weeks ago? A summer that kept breaking its own records. To understand why the maps look the way they do, you have to understand what kind of summer this actually was. 2026 has become the first year on record in which the UK has recorded temperatures of 35 baccalaureate or higher in 3 separate calendar months. It's also become the first year to record 6 separate days above 35.5 degrees nationally, breaking the previous joint record of 5 days set back in 1976 and again in 2020. On 13th August, Kew Gardens in London hit a provisional 30.1 making it the 5th hottest day ever recorded in the UK. By early August, the country had already logged 33 days, somewhere above 30 to Scurry Waters, just 1 day short of the single-year national record set in 1995. This wasn't one dramatic spike. It was a sequence, 4 separate heat waves rolling through since May, each one arriving before the ground had properly recovered from the last. And that detail, the fact that this heat kept stacking on top of itself rather than arriving and departing cleanly, is exactly why what happens next matters so much. The map. Nobody expected to fill in this fast. The most alarming map isn't a temperature map at all. It's a drought map, and it's the one that should genuinely stop you. In early August, the National Drought Group declared that more than 70% of England, closer to 3/4 by some readings, was officially in drought. That figure alone is startling. What's more startling is how it got there. England just recorded its driest in July on record. A record that stretches back to 1836, with rainfall across the southeast coming in at roughly 1% of the long-term average for the month. Reservoir storage across England fell to around 66%, nearly 14 percentage points below where it should be for the time of year, with several reservoirs classed as exceptionally low. River flow monitoring sites across the country have shifted from below normal to exceptionally low in quick succession, and groundwater levels are following the same downward slope. Here's the part that catches people off guard. None of that map turns green again, just because the heat stops and the temperature drops back into the 20s. A drought doesn't end when the heat wave ends. It ends when enough rain falls to refill reservoirs, recharge groundwater, and restore river flow. And that can take weeks or months, even after the sun stops beating down on the ground every single day. The heat wave was the headline. The drought is the story that keeps running long after the headline moves on. Fire on a map that used to be green. If the drought map is alarming, the fire severity map is the one that's actually been forcing people out of their homes. By $10 in August, more than 23,000 hectares of the UK had already burned in 2026, spread across 72 separate fires larger than 30 hectares each. That's an extraordinary total for a single season, and it arrived on the back of a country that had already logged its worst wildfire year on record just 12 months earlier. On 14th of August, with conditions deteriorating further, the government issued a temporary ban on disposable barbecues and sent an emergency alert directly to phones across England and Wales, warning people of the wildfire risk in language usually reserved for genuine national emergencies. Within days, a major incident was declared near Landovery in Carmarthenshire. Dozens of homes were evacuated, and a new fire minister was appointed specifically to manage the crisis unfolding across the country. Natural England's Fire Severity Index, the live map that tracks exactly how dangerous conditions are for a fire to start and spread, has been showing very high risk across huge stretches of the southwest, East Anglia, London, South Yorkshire, and the East Midlands, with pockets rated at exceptional, the highest category the index has. And this is the mechanism that catches people out every single time. The fire risk doesn't peak during the hottest day of the heat wave. It peaks in the days right after the heat starts to break, when a shift in wind arrives on top of vegetation that 3 weeks of relentless heat and almost no rainfall have turned into dry, ready fuel. The heat primes the landscape like a match waiting in dry grass. The wind that finally brings the cooler conditions everyone's been waiting for is often the exact thing that strikes it. 3 regions, 3 different versions of the same danger. This isn't playing out the same way everywhere, and that's part of what makes it so hard for one national forecast to capture. In the southeast and East Anglia, the driest corners of the country all summer. The story is almost entirely about drought, and it's knock. On effects, these are the regions posting the lowest rainfall totals in England, some receiving barely 1% of their long-term August average, and they're the ones where reservoir storage and river flow have fallen furthest below normal. Here, the danger isn't a single dramatic event. It's the slow, grinding kind. Restricted water use, stressed crops, and rivers running low enough to threaten wildlife long after anyone's talking about the heat wave itself. In the southwest and across parts of Wales, the story has been fire. This is the region where a major incident was declared near. Landovery, where evacuations forced dozens of families out of their homes with barely any warning, and where the fire severity index has repeatedly flagged exceptional risk. The terrain here, dry moorland, forestry, and grassland, behaves like kindling once weeks of heat have stripped the moisture out of it, and it only takes one spark, a discarded cigarette, an overheated engine, a disposable barbecue, to turn that stored dryness into a... Fire crews can spend days chasing across a hillside. And in pockets of the East Midlands and South Yorkshire, it's a combination of both. Drought conditions severe enough to trigger a change in official Environment Agency status, sitting directly underneath fire severity. Readings rated very high. Same underlying cause, 3 different regional consequences, each one requiring a different kind of vigilance from the people living there. Why cracked ground turns relief into risk. There's a second, quieter mechanism sitting underneath both of these maps, and it explains why this handoff keeps catching an entire country off guard. 3 weeks of intense heat and almost no rain doesn't just dry out soil, it hardens it. Ground that would normally soak up rainfall like a sponge instead bakes into a compacted, almost water-resistant surface. The same way clay left in the sun cracks and hardens rather than staying soft. When rain does eventually arrive, and forecasters are already watching for more unsettled, showery conditions moving in from the Atlantic in the coming days, that rain doesn't sink into the ground the way it would after a normal British summer. It runs straight off the surface, overwhelming drains and rivers that are already running at exceptionally low levels, turning what should be welcome relief into a genuine flood risk almost overnight. That's the trap hiding inside this particular ending. The country has spent 3 weeks desperate for rain. And the first proper rain that arrives could, in the driest, hardest hit areas, cause more disruption in a single afternoon than the heat caused in 3 weeks. Not because the rain itself is unusual, but because of what 3 weeks of heat did to the ground waiting underneath it. It's worth being precise about why this happens, because it isn't just intuition, it's basic soil physics. Healthy topsoil is full of tiny pore spaces that let water filter downward gradually, the way a sponge draws liquid in through its structure rather than letting it pool on the surface. Weeks of intense heat collapse those pore spaces as the clay and organic material inside the soil contracts and hardens. What's left behaves less like absorbent ground and more like a paved surface with a thin layer of dust on top. Add heavy rain to that, and instead of soaking away over hours, the water simply moves downhill across roads into drains that are already running near capacity because nobody expected this much water this quickly. Add the fact that many rivers are currently running at exceptionally low flow, meaning their banks and channels have shrunk over the summer, and you get a system that can go from critically dry to locally flooded within the same 48-hour window without ever passing through anything resembling normal. A nation reading 2 different warnings at once. There's a psychological piece to this too, and it's worth sitting with because it's the reason so few people are watching these maps at all right now. When a heat wave breaks in Britain, the instinct is pure relief. The oppressive nights end, people go back to normal routines, and the news cycle moves on almost immediately to whatever comes next. Heat health alerts get lifted. Nobody's checking a drought bulletin from the Environment Agency or a fire severity index from Natural England once the forecast says cloudy with a chance of rain. But that's precisely the window in which these 2 other maps are doing the most damage, quietly, without a single dramatic headline attached to either one. The same falling temperatures that bring relief from the heat are being read by the ground itself as an entirely different kind of warning. Fire services keep their highest alert levels active for days after a heat wave ends, not during it. Water companies keep hosepipe bans and usage restrictions in place for weeks after the last hot day, not because they're being cautious, but because the reservoirs genuinely haven't recovered. The maps that matter most right now are the ones nobody's looking at, because the one map everybody does look at, the temperature forecast, is finally telling them good news. What the coming days actually look like. So does this actually end here, or does the pattern keep going? The honest answer from forecasters is not cleanly. The Met Office's longer-range outlook has pointed to more unsettled, showery conditions moving in from the Atlantic through the back half of the month, which is genuinely good news for reservoirs, but it isn't the kind of sustained, soaking rain that reverses a drought this severe in one go. A single wet week doesn't undo the driest July since 1836. It takes rain arriving steadily over weeks into ground that's ready to absorb it rather than shed it before any of these maps actually turn back to a color that means normal. In the meantime, fire authorities are continuing to treat the days immediately after this heat wave as some of the highest risk of the entire summer, not the lowest. Water companies across affected regions are holding restrictions in place, and forecasters are watching specifically for the first heavy rainfall event to land on hardened, drought-baked ground, because that's the moment flood risk in the hardest hit areas actually peaks, not during the storm. Everyone was bracing for weeks ago, but in the days right after, everyone assumed the danger had already passed. This is also why you'll likely keep seeing conflicting advice over the next few weeks, and why that isn't a contradiction so much as a reflection of how unusual this handoff actually is. Environment Agency guidance will keep urging water conservation even as rain starts to fall, because a few wet days don't refill a reservoir that's 14 percentage points below normal. Fire services will keep warning people away from disposable barbecues and open flames, even as the forecast cools, because dry vegetation doesn't rehydrate the moment the thermometer drops. And local authorities in the hardest hit catchments may issue flood guidance in the same week they're still enforcing hosepipe bans. Two warnings that would normally feel like opposites, both accurate, both describing the same underlying ground. What this actually means for you, if you're in one of the regions that's just come through this heat wave, particularly anywhere, across the southeast, East Anglia, or the southwest, treat the coming week with the same level of attention you gave the heat itself, not less. If you're near dry moorland, grassland, or forestry, understand that the fire risk hasn't dropped just because the temperature has. It's often at its highest in exactly this window, while the wind picks up and the fuel is still primed. And if heavy rain does arrive where you are, don't assume it's simply the drought ending. On hardened, baked ground, the first hard rain can run off fast enough to cause localized flooding, even at rainfall totals that wouldn't normally be a concern. The real story of this heat wave was never just about how hot it got. It's about what 3 weeks of that heat did to the ground underneath an entire country, and how a very ordinary, welcome drop in temperature can quietly mark the start of the next chapter, rather than the end of the story. The heat is gone. What it left behind is still very much here, and it's the map most people aren't checking that's actually worth watching this week.